Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1258 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Monday morning. And today's podcast is going to be myself and Glen Willis of Peachtree Hoops. Glen's been joining me for a lot of podcasts recently, and shouts to Glen for all the time. But our player capsule series is winding down. Today's podcast will be myself and Glen talking about Clint Capela, and we are both fans of his and his impact overall. So it's sort of a deep dive on Capela, pros, cons, etc., a full scope on Capela, both present and future. Elsewhere on the podcast recently, we've had NBA draft coverage wall to wall, and the draft is now a week and a half away. We've had Jake Rosen, we've had Ricky O'Donnell, we have Brian Schroeder come up later this week. So wall to wall coverage on the NBA draft, and please subscribe to the podcast. Tell your friends, and check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and of course our YouTube channel on the video side. Without further delay, we'll have the intro, and then it'll be myself and Glen talking about Clint Capela.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
I am joined once again by my friend Glen Willis to discuss another player on the Hawks roster. Interesting one today with Clint Capela. Welcome back, Glen. And we're recording this, by the way, take you behind the curtain, right after a memorable NBA Finals game. So Glenn and I are recording at midnight Eastern. So he's fresh. I'm probably not, but here we are.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm 3 hours behind you, but we're probably about at the same point. I was at a conference all week that was like never-ending social. And I'm a very outgoing, sociable person, but man, 4 straight days of that, then flying home was. I should be in better shape than you, but I'm afraid I might not be.
No, I understand completely, and we'll do what we do. I appreciate you coming on yet again to talk about another player with me. I don't know when this is running, but in the near future, for sure. And we've gone through most of the roster at this point. This one is interesting in a lot of different ways. As I mentioned before, Clint Capela is a player that I know I think I can speak for you, and you can correct me. I think you and I are probably higher on Clint than most people at this point. He got, I think mostly people understand that he's been really impactful, particularly on defense, of course, and he led the entire world in rebounding 2 years ago and still is a elite rebounder. But also there's a lot of pushback. I'm sure you've seen a lot of it, like I have, on Twitter about Clint in particular because of Kongwu's presence, and Clint's weaknesses are, pretty evident at times, and it can sort of overshadow things. So, and obviously there's the other factor, which we won't touch on a ton here, of the contract extension, which he has not even started yet. In fact, it will not start till after next season. He still has 3 years remaining on his contract at this point in time, which throws an interesting wrinkle into things as well. But I say all of that, Glenn, to sort of tee you up. But I mean, where are you at as of sort of bodies with you on this podcast? Like, where are you at sort of mentally with Clint as we head into an offseason where it could be that they move on from him at some point in time, but also he could still be around and be a productive player?
Yeah, I think it's when you have a veteran player that's locked up, I think he's kind of right where you want him to be. You can keep him and you're going to be in good shape. You're going to have a good, easily, in my mind, one of the 10 best starting centers in the league, especially if you prioritize defense at the position, right? I don't want to sit here and do kind of a ranking exercise, but, someone wants to go, well, Glenn is probably top 12, whatever, right? But he's, in my mind, in the upper third, easily. I can't imagine someone arguing that he's not in the upper half of the best starting centers in the league. So if you keep him on the contract with the extension, I think you're in good shape, right? If you feel like you need to move him, I think there's a ton of need at the center position around the league. Teams that are trying to improve on defense, teams that like the Hawks were, basically about a year and a half ago when they made the move to get him, needing some way to kind of establish some defensive foundation, and a team I think that might be willing to kind of make a move for him if that's the route the Hawks decide to go. There's going to be plenty of demand for him. So it seems like there's so much upheaval among Hawks fans about him, and I don't get it because I think this is kind of right where you want to be. He's I don't know if he's ever going to make an all defensive team again. The Hawks would have to be better as a whole on defense for him to kind of land at that level of consideration. But that really shouldn't matter, I think, in terms of how we're looking at him. But just like you mentioned, he's one of the 3 or 4 best rebounders in the league in my mind. He's one of the best 6, 7, 8 kind of drop centers in the league, and he has some ability to get up to the level of the screen and do some workout too and recover. He's a terrific rim runner. He works hard as anybody as a screener, which is super helpful to Trey. So, what he brings, I think, is really, really valuable. But, people who have in my mind, a coherent idea about moving on from him because they feel like, well, Okongwu needs the playing time and needs, the opportunity to kind of step up his role and deliver on the value of a 6th overall pick and things like that. I think there's a reasonable conversation about what's the right thing to do there. But the most important thing to me is he's right where you'd want someone right here. Keep him, you're good. Trade him, you're going to be in good shape, kind of getting value for him. And I think that's a great position to be with him right now for the team.
Definitely. I mean, we talked about with Okongwu, which of course we recorded pretty recently, about how good they really are at center overall. When you factor in 48 minutes on a lot of nights with those two guys only, that's a pretty good spot to be in on both ends of the floor, really, but especially on defense. And to sort of touch on the overall with Clint, we'll definitely get into offense and defense separately and also probably together along the way. But this isn't everything. You and I in particular are not like married to these kind of numbers, but I pulled a couple of the more advanced sort of all-in-one metrics that I trust the most. And they both had Capela as like a top 55 or 60 player in the league even last year. There is this very overarching I hate the word narrative, but that's what's coming to my mind right now, that Clint had this terrible season or this really down year last year. And yes, he got off to a slow start. I think we would acknowledge that. He was not healthy coming out of training camp, didn't really do a lot in the offseason. It wasn't great for the first couple months of the season. That's definitely fair to say. But even with all of that, he was in the top 55 in the league in overall EPM and overall 538's Raptor model this year. That's this year. 2 years ago, he was even better than that. I mean, this is not a 2 years ago podcast, but he was probably a top 35 or 40 player in the league 2 years ago. That's how good he was. And obviously Trey is the number one reason, but he was a huge part of why they made the run that they made 2 years ago. And I think this year, we talked about it a lot at the time, both in this format and other formats. Like when he kind of arrived back to being his old self, they were a lot better. And in the second half of the season, he played, he actually shot the ball well again. Obviously, shooting is relative for him. It's him just finishing around the rim. There's no real shooting from Clint, but he was efficient. His defense was all over the place. And he just turned 28 years old. He's sort of an old 28. He got drafted in 2014. He's been around and played a lot of minutes, but he's not old either. Like this is not a guy who is in his early 30s. By the end of the contract, he'll be in his early 30s. But right now, he just turned 28. It'll be his age 28 season next year. So he's not over the hill by any means. And again, he's got some weaknesses, he's got some strengths, but there is really a lot to like with Clint. But I mean, I didn't run this by you beforehand. What do you make of just the overall? And obviously, this is not what we're going to do on this podcast overall here, but like just the notion that Clint was a top 60 player in the league last year. I think it seems reasonable to me, even with the acknowledgement that he had kind of a rough start. Once he found himself, he was kind of the guy he was 2 years ago.
Yeah, agreed. That feels like about the right range to me, when considering the whole season. The prior season he was probably the top 40. I don't know where exactly we'd put him.
I mean, in a normal season 2 years ago. I mean, you mentioned all defense teams earlier on the conversation. I mean, he very credibly received a few some all defense and defensive player of the year votes 2 years ago. And he was never going to win it. Rudy Gobert exists. And I get that. He's not better than Rudy Gobert. I understand that. But he really was, in my mind, a top, 6 or 7 defender in the league 2 years ago. That's how good he was. Especially when you factor in rebounding, because that does matter too. You have to close possessions. And he was, I believe, I pulled this earlier. He actually led the entire NBA in all 3 rebounding categories 2 years ago: offense, defense, and total. And that's hard to do, just for the record.
Yep.
Anyway, he's really good.
Yeah, he helps himself with the offensive rebounds with his tip.
He does. That's fair.
If you're at my age, you call it the Moses Malone, or I'm sure there's others, but yeah, I mean, top 60 feels about right. I feel like it's hard for the casual fan or a fan that's not interested in really getting into the details to understand how well he organizes them on defense, how well he anchors on defense, how he kind of, when they're struggling defensively, he can kind of reconstitute them and things like that. How well he plays without fouling, long stretches. And then, as the season went along, Nate was playing him at times 10, 11 straight minutes, which not a lot of centers can do that, right? A lot of centers are about 7 minutes, maybe 8 minutes, and then they sit and get a break and get back out for another 7 or 8 minutes. But to try to make some pairing work with Gallo and JC and a Kongwu, Nate would sometimes play Clint for long stretches, and I think that as hard as Clint runs, and as much as he moves, he covers a lot of ground in the half court on offense because he works so hard as a screener. He's in so many pick and rolls. He's diving to the rim with force, and so he just exerts a lot of energy. And so to be able to play that long for stretches when they need that is critical. So the Hawks don't have the strongest rebounding team apart from him, so that's a critical kind of thing to kind of factor in. And he just kind of owns the defensive glass, kind of single-handedly when he's in there. I mean, fans who get really frustrated after a loss will think about the 3, bunnies he missed in the game and be really frustrated with, especially if it was like a 3-point loss or something like that. And that's just, Clint is never going to have even average hands. It's never going to happen. That's always going to be a part of kind of what he brings to the floor. He's improved. I mean, since he was 24, 25 or whatever, but he's still never going to get the average. He'll make a surprising pass to a corner now and then without and get it generally on target, things like that. But again, the value of what he brings on both ends of the court really is what he does without the ball in his hands. And I know I've said this so many times, but one of the kind of the brilliant aspects of Travis going out and getting him was that, I mean, who has at that point in time when they acquired him had run more pick and rolls with an elite pick and roll lead guard? At that point in time, he'd run so many. He had so many reps with Harden and Houston, and the Hawks were able to just drop him right in next to Trey, and that has been a massive part of Trey getting to where he is, being one of the truly elite offensive players in the league. So when I know that if you want to go look at certain stats offensively, his finishing at the rim, considering his size and considering the easy shots at the rim Trey creates for him, you could certainly poke at that and say, oh, I wish he was better. Sure, right? But when you consider all the other things that he brings, I think top 60 is a solid way to kind of look at him. And then, when you think about his unique defensive value as a guy who can drop all day long and kind of do it basically as well as almost anyone that's not Rudy in the league in my mind, right? I mean, when Giannis plays center, Giannis is so athletic, so he's kind of an outlier, and stuff like that. But then he's not married to the drop, right? He can hedge and even trap sometimes, and he can, he executes the red scheme when they're switching 1 through 4 by calling all the switches and those switches so confidently. I mean, and so just there's so much that doesn't necessarily jump out at someone who, unless they're interested in the real kind of nuanced areas of the game, especially at the center position, that I feel like it's a remiss. And that's why I find myself frustrated with the conversation about him sometimes. It brings absolutely a ton of value in areas that don't always jump out at everyone.
Today's show is brought to you by TrueBill and free trials often renewed without your consent. If you didn't know that, it's because it's actually a business scam. It's out to get you. Do not let corporations pocket your money out of their own greed. Instead, download TrueBill and take control of all your subscriptions at this point in time. And TrueBill is a new app, helps you identify and stop paying for subscriptions that you don't want, don't need, or even forgot about entirely. And on average, people save up to $720 a year using TrueBill. It makes things incredibly simple when it comes to canceling subscriptions. That's important because companies make it very hard to cancel on purpose, and that's really deliberate on their end. Just link your accounts together. TrueBill will cancel all those unwanted subscriptions in just one tap. And as someone who manages a ton of subscriptions across the sports world and all the stuff that I actually have to keep up with, I can tell you TrueBill is absolutely awesome, and I highly recommend it. TrueBill has 2 million users, and TrueBill has helped people save more than $100 million at this point in time. Do not fall for the scams of subscription services. Start canceling today at TrueBill.com/LockedOnNBA. Go right now to TrueBill.com/LockedOnNBA. It could save you thousands of dollars each year. One more time, that is TrueBill.com/LockedOnNBA. I want to dive into the offense first, just because, we all know he's good on defense. There's degrees of that. We'll get into that for sure. But we sort of talked over it a minute ago. But generally speaking, Clint is still an effective offensive player. I know that there is frustration with his finishing in his hands, and those are realistic frustrations. You mentioned it earlier, like that does kind of stick out to people, and I totally get why. And I know that I am far less emotional about these things than a lot of fans are, because that's my job, and I have to be. I watch too much basketball to be that way. But I mean, it is fair to say, like, in his last 4 years in Houston, he shot 65-ish% from the field. And the 2 years in Atlanta, it's about 60% from the field, which is still a good number. But when you're only taking layups and dunks, it's not a fantastic number. It's fine. I will say it was night and day first half, second half last year as a point, just because I pulled this stat. He shot 67% from the floor from MLK Day on, basically when the Hawks started to be good last season. If you draw a line in the sand, like that's basically the halfway point of last season. He was excellent in terms of his finishing around the rim, percentage wise. Again, it's not always aesthetically pleasing. We all know this about Clint. The hands are what they are. And I will note that he actually had a 6-year low at the free throw line last year, which even adds to the frustration. He shot 47% from the line. He's never been good, but he kind of found something where he was shooting in like the mid 50s before. And that's different than 47%. So that is notable. I'm not sure if it's a confidence thing or what, but also he took less. I wonder if he had a little bit of a gun shyness that I think we kind of noticed at times. He didn't want to get fouled, and he never wants to get fouled, I'm sure, because he's not a great free throw shooter, but it was even worse at times last year. But you mentioned the screening. He's so effective there. The offensive rebounding is hugely valuable. And as a dive threat, I know they have Collins as well. They have a Congo as well, but Clint is still quite effective, just the gravity of it. I know he's not the most, again, aesthetically pleasing. He's not going to do crazy stuff with the ball. I know I'm listing a lot of things here, but one more thing before I forget it. He had a career best turnover rate last year, 6% turnover rate. That is like minuscule. That's a very, very good number. I know he's not handling the ball a lot, but he does not turn the ball over ever, which does matter. That does boost your efficiency. And his assist rate was way up as well. So like he's never going to be like Draymond as a short roll guy, but he can pass a little bit better than he used to. Doesn't turn the ball over. And yeah, he's not a high usage guy by any means, but there are positives. We can get into the negatives as well, but I wanted to throw some stats out there just because, like, I think he gets a generally bad rap on offense, even if I understand it.
Yeah, agreed. And, it's one of those things too. Like we said this before, I think when we were talking about Bogey, but it'd be nice to give Trey some truth serum and get him to kind of talk about how much Clint kind of helps him, And I could think back to some video breakdowns I've done over the last, couple of years, or the 2 seasons Clint's, played here, and where Clint will do things that very few other big men know how to do. So, and I'll just kind of give one example. So let's say Trey is trying to go to his right and use a screen from Clint, and the defense doesn't let him get right. Clint will flip, and then Trey will give him the ball, and Clint will just give the ball right back and kind of get back into that screening situation. So, a lot of big men will say, I'm going to get to a DHO and let Trey come get the ball, which still allows the defense to push Trey in a specific position. But what Clint looks for is a chance to give it back while Trey still has separation, and then Trey can decide which direction he wants to go. That's an example of the nuance that Clint brings all the time that I feel like not everyone kind of notices, right? Is that he knows, and I think this is largely because he did this so many times with Harden, and Harden is a player that will give all of his teammates feedback on how they're helping him or not helping him, for good and bad, almost always positive, I would assume. It's, teams have to be able to kind of talk honestly with each other. But all of that stuff that Clint brings, Okongwu is not ready to do that stuff yet, even though Okongwu, for his experience levels, is doing quite well. But even JC is going to be not nearly as nuanced as a screener in that area. JC can kind of dive with the same effectiveness as Clint, but when it comes to helping Trey get what he wants when the defense denies it once or twice, and he still has a way to reposition himself and manage his distance with Trey to get Trey the ball back where he wants to get it, that stuff is absolutely massive for Trey. And if you look at the season Trey had, to me, I can't separate it much from the impact that Clint helps him with all the nuance he brings as a partner for Trey. And for that reason, that's why I'm like, we've talked about, some people may be wanting to see JC traded. I'm like, be careful what you ask for. Yeah. Similar conversation with Bogey. It's the same way with Clint. Is I feel like Trey would have a harder time on offense without Clint, this next season than he would with them. Doesn't mean that there aren't scenarios where that it would make some sense to go ahead and make a move. It doesn't mean that. I'm just just do it with eyes wide open, appreciating all the value he brings on that end. And he for sure, like the last 5 weeks of the season was really we just watched the Warriors pull 2-2, and Draymond would not do anything at the rim.
No.
And I felt like that reminded me of like kind of how Clint's last 5 or 6 weeks in the season looked, So that was, that's something, and for sure. And I understand there's kind of frustration with that. But I mean, the way he helps his teammates on offense, it's not just Trey. Bogey knows how to use him too, and things like that. I feel like it's really undervalued and needs to be, I think, fully appreciated.
Yeah, there is real nuance with Capela on offense in particular, just because, like, for example, if you go at, I'm looking at cleaning the glass right now. If you go only on rim attempts, which is basically what Clint does, like occasionally he'll take like, those 5-6 footers that classify as the short mid, but like what he does most of the time is rim attempts. And he's a little bit below average at 67%. That's a good number in terms of field goal percentage, but at the rim, that's not a great number. It's not terrible. It's not a great number. But because that's all he does, he is above average efficiency-wise overall by every metric in terms of shooting. Like effective field goal percentage, even true shooting with his bad free throw shooting, he's still above average at true shooting. And it's because he knows what he can and can't do. And now, obviously, there are some of those, once or twice a game who have those ugly post-ups. And he just like, it's one of those like reward the big man kind of things where you have to be okay with it every once in a while. But it's just an interesting, like, there's a lot of dichotomy stuff in these numbers. But what you said earlier stands out to me because we have to go way back now, but when they traded for Clint while he was injured, by the way, they did it for, and really in my mind, these like 3-pronged reasons. And prong one was to help the defense, obviously, which he did. I mean, he's anchored their defense for 2 seasons. And I know it hasn't been great, but when he plays, they're always better, and the numbers are okay when he plays, and they're not when he doesn't, generally. Then you have what you talk about all the time, and I think you're 100% right, just having someone that knows how to run pick and roll with Trey. That was a huge investment. And then also just like give them competence at center. I think people kind of don't remember the times when they had really bad center play, but that season before they got Clint was not a lot of fun in a lot of ways. And I'm not picking on anybody individually, but there was some really rough center play that season. And just to have that competence goes a long way. Now, that doesn't mean Capela's a perfect player. He's not, especially, he has weaknesses, and you can sort of talk about what a Kongwu does versus Clint. We talked about a little bit on the Kongwu podcast, but you can both acknowledge it might be time to do something else at some point if an opportunity arises, and you can also value what Clint has brought even amid the frustration. So it's a really he's very interesting to talk about, especially, you and I watch every possession basically, and if you don't, it's almost like it stands out to you more what he can and can't do, because listen, he's never going to give you anything beyond what he gives you now on offense. Like he is what he is. And there are a lot of strengths to that, but also, and we've discussed it a ton, but it's worth remembering we spent like 6 months basically on the Collins Capela pairing. And like, I get it. Like friend of the podcast, Tower Jones, has talked about this with me on and offline. Like at a certain point, you don't want to have to build around Clint. And he does limit you in some ways. Like you have to think about who you're pairing with him as well. Like famously, Ben Simmons has been a hypothetical topic for a long time. And it's like, my stock response is like, he can't play with Clint. And it's true that he can't play with Clint probably, but also do you want to, there is an idea, and I totally get this. Like you don't want to have to worry about Clint long-term. And I do get that too. So there's, as with any player, there's a give and take, and we're going to get into the defense obviously in a minute, because that's really where he brings even more value. But I just think that I'm not saying anything particularly revelatory here, but it's just such an interesting conversation because he's not a bum on offense. Like I think he's generally underrated on offense, but also he just looks like he looks. It's just I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm saying. It's just like it's hard to get any more appreciation for him than he already has. Like if you made your mind up on Clint Capela's offense, like I'm not going to change your mind probably, which I understand.
Yeah. I mean, it all makes sense. It's all relevant to me. And, a couple of things to respond to there. One is like, he's never going to have better hands than he is right now. One small thing he might be able to do at this point to improve his finishing, which he did some this past, I mean, it was in small stretches, but he probably needs to, when he has a chance to be a two-handed finisher now, or when he was younger,
Yeah.
he was more, had more accurate with one hand. But stop and gather, let the defender jump and go up. I mean, no one should be able to block him when he has two. And there were times when he would catch together if the lob was a little off, or a rebound or whatever, fully kind of reload and things like that. And the foot injuries and the knee injury has probably taken just enough of his verticality away that he might need
Yeah.
that. So if that's something he's adapting to, that might help him be a marginally better finisher. The other thing I want to take a minute and kind of focus on offensively, to give Travis Schlenk really some credit for how he prepared Trey to be able, on Trey's side, to be able to work with a partner like Clint too. And I don't, neither one of us think Travis has a perfect track record with all his moves. I don't think we ever understood the Jeremy Lin trade in terms of what they gave up and not getting more out of it.
That's an underrated one. That's one that people always forget. But
right.
I'll never forget that. That trade made no sense at all. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but the thing, the kind of the path that Travis took here, which to me shows a lot of foresight and understanding. Okay, if Vince Travis thinking, if we go back kind of 3 or 4 years in this process or whatever, like what kind of partner do we need to put with Trey? Could we need someone who can run, rim run, who has speed, who can dive with force to the rim, etc. I know people thought, like, when you sent out Dwight Howard and brought back Miles Plumlee, like how does Plumlee kind of ever kind of mix it all? Plumlee, I don't think people understand how fast he was, right? How athletic he was, and things like that, and just putting that into the mix, at all there, right? And then Damian Jones too, like a yawn kind of transaction. But a certain number of reps that Trey got with a fast, athletic center that can get from the point of the screen to the rim quickly. Neither Plumlee nor Damian were going to be like in the picture once the Hawks kind of hit on the roster they felt good about. But Travis found a couple of guys that Trey could get those reps with, like fast moving bigs, athletic bigs that can dive with force and dive with quickness. And that, to me, that shows someone who is thinking through the steps that one has to take to kind of get a roster to where they need it, and to give Trey some exposure to that, even if it's not anyone who's going to kind of stick around. So, I think there's some room for some appreciation how kind of careful Travis has been about trying to put pieces around Trey that would help. Like Vince I thought was kind of in that category as well. Just a real nuanced pick and pop guy that can handle the ball and stuff like that. But I mean, people might be laughing, but no, Damian Jones and then Mason Plumlee, just in the mix around the team and all that sort of stuff, gave Trey some reps that for a low cost that they would have got elsewhere. And Trey wouldn't have been ready to kind of capitalize on what Clint bought if they'd never had a fast big man, a rim running big man, a guy who could dive with force like that until Clint. So I just think it's an important kind of perspective that the table was kind of set for Clint in a smart way when Clint got here as well. Now Clint is, in my mind, towards the top of the league in big men that know how to help their guard and the pick and roll. We talked about that, but there's a lot that has gone into getting the Trey Clint pairing to be what it is today, and I'm not anxious to see them move on from it unless there's just a wonderful opportunity to get unique value.
Today's show was brought to you by BetOnline, and the NBA Finals are rolling along right now. Things are getting very interesting between the Celtics and the Warriors. But as a backdrop, our partners at BetOnline have the number one source for all the sports betting needs that you have and your information that you're seeking this year. Find all the latest odds, news, and developments across the sports world, including the entire NBA playoffs, MLB scores and odds, latest fight stuff, as well as future bets. That includes the NFL, college football, college basketball, even NBA for next season, baseball. All that fun stuff is available right now at BetOnline. BetOnline's continued source for all wager information across the board. That includes live betting and esports and poker and a ton of casino games across the board as well. And beyond that, BetOnline has other sports covered. That includes hockey and golf and tennis, auto racing, horse racing, soccer, cricket. They have entertainment bets and all the sports that you can think of, table tennis. All of that stuff's in the mix at BetOnline. Head there right now at BetOnline on your computer, mobile device to learn more about all the trends and the action in the sports world. BetOnline, where the game starts. This is sort of a bridge between offense and defense, but you mentioned his speed a few times. And I think that, that's underrated thing still, I think, with Clint. He's not the same bursty guy that he was when he was 22. He's not. Because you mentioned the leg injuries and all that stuff, just the Achilles and all that. And he's a little bit bigger than he used to be. But like in a straight line, he's still a really good athlete as a center. He's not nuclear athlete anymore, but like I think he's probably undervalued as an athlete in general, especially in terms of going, like you said, like, from touchdown or just a straight rim roller to the rim from the 3-point line down. Like he can still move in a straight line in a big way. And it doesn't mean he's flying around like obviously Okongwu was a lot more like, I don't know, quick, or however you want to say that, more rangy than Capela is at this point in time. But Okongwu was like 99th percentile in terms of doing that as a center. So you can't really compare those two. I think if you compare Clint to an average NBA center, he's still an above average athlete. That's pretty clear to me. And I feel like that sort of transition in a defense as well, because, he wasn't, in terms of the overall season, the numbers and all this stuff, he wasn't quite as good as he was 2 years ago, but that was an unfair comparison. That was perhaps his career year. That's how good he was. We won't litigate that all again, but again, he was clearly like an uber elite defender 2 years ago. And I think, again, this year he was quite good. I mean, I think there's a lot of this gets boiled down. I'm sure this drives you crazy. There's this, a lot of it gets boiled down from like, can a guy switch? You know what I'm talking about? Like a lot of times when it's discussed, it's like, especially with Clint versus Onyeka, it's like, well, one's the switchy guy and the other guy just has to be a drop big or whatever it is. It's always very simplified. And I get that. I'm not a scheme expert either, but I think it is worth noting that Clint probably can't switch a ton, but you still have a team with Trae Young, so you're going to be playing a lot of drop anyway. The Hawks are never going to be a full-on switch 1 through 5 team as long as Trae is here. That's pretty clear. Can you do a little bit more scheme-wise in terms of flying around with Onyeka? Maybe down the line, but there's a reason why they're maybe interested in Rudy Gobert. Like, you got to have to play a lot of traditional defense with Trae Young. That's just part of the fun, and Clint's still really, really good at that. I want you to talk about, because you're way better at the stuff than I am, about what he can do scheme-wise defensively, because I think it just gets boiled down, like I said, a lot to like, oh, he's just a drop big. And he does that really well. But what can he still do? What is he good at? What is he not good at defensively at this point in time? Limitations. Like, what's sort of the overall picture in your mind? Because beyond like the obvious tenets of like awesome rebounder, good rim protector, like what else is there in your mind defensively?
Yeah, I mean, I think his ability to recover when he gets dragged away from the rim when he's defending a Jokic is the kind of the most obvious example there. There are others, right? Brook Lopez that's operating 5 feet higher than the 3-point line,
29 footers, so yeah.
Right, and things like that. His ability to kind of cover ground and get back to the rim even when he's dragged out there is pretty elite. There aren't many guys that can do that the way he can. And the way he stays oriented, a lot of big guys, when they're moving that fast and recovering that much space, will kind of lose their spatial awareness, if you will, and lose track of where the ball is, where the shooter is, and he is incredible in my mind at kind of maintaining all of that. If sometimes it's even just him just focusing on, okay, where's the ball, where's the release point, and just measuring that down and tracking it down. That's phenomenal. And especially, like you said, when he's on the floor with Trae, when they're sacrificing so much in some matchup that's there, his ability to recover and kind of pull a play out of the defensive possession out of the ditch, if you will, is important, and it's quite good. He's probably, I was just guessing, like top 5 in the league in terms of ability to recover back to the rim, make a play at the rim, and kind of get that block. So that's there. We've talked a little bit about the organizational kind of skills he has, the communication skills. He's, just as solid as it gets in those areas. And like I said, I don't think the Hawks want to really ever get to a point where they're switching 1 through 5. They may want to do it with some lineups,
right? If
they shift towards more Okongwu minutes, which we've talked about in that episode, that he needs more time on the floor, right?
Definitely,
and things like that. But I don't think that's going to be kind of a core part of what they do, kind of really regularly. This started with LP, but LP loved to run the quote red scheme, which is mostly a 1 through 4 switching, but it's not automatic switching. It's where the big is typically about 1 step below the free throw line, seeing the angle a defender has, how effective the screen is going to be, how much separation you can anticipate. there's a lot of processing that has to go on for the big man to call out every single play, and when they're running that red scheme. And Clint is excellent at that, right? He had really good coaching staffs in Houston, which helped him with that. I mean, I know, like, even going back as far as like Kevin McHale, he's kind of picked on as, a coach that couldn't do a ton, in the league, but he was awesome defensive coach. He had an awesome defensive coaching staff when he was there.
Well, and also imagine being like a 20-year-old big and your head coach is Kevin McHale. It's not the worst thing in the world, you know what I mean?
for sure. You talk about angles and footwork and leverage and, I mean, all that sort of stuff. And to Clint's credit, by all appearances, he kind of soaked it all up. So he sees everything. He communicates everything. He calls everything. He always knows what defense they're in. They can switch kind of defensive schemes if they need to based upon the opposing team substitution on the fly without having to call a timeout, and Clint gets them organized. And that is, so important. It's like, and to keep going back to this, especially when you're kind of tracking, okay, who's on the court that Trey's messed up with now? How do we want to handle that? How do we want to deal with that? Oh, they made a substitution. Now Trey's matchup changed. So we want to change a little bit of what we're doing on defense. And for Clint to be able to handle all of that all the time, at all times, without timeouts, is critical. And in my mind, that's probably the area where he sets the bar high enough, and I'm like, oh man, is Onyeka, how close is he to being able to do that? I don't know.
Which isn't even, and we said it on that podcast, but just to back you up, it's not about Onyeka being some shortcoming of his.
No.
It's because Clint's so good at it. It's not a situation, and I think people probably know this about us, but like, it's not even us doubting Okongwu. It's that Capela is,
we're high on him.
really good, like really, really, really good. I mean, the way that I put it, and I'll put it back to you. Like, I said it a lot this way, but like, just the amount of stuff they put on Clint, both personnel wise around him, because that's not a secret. The Hawks not had the greatest defensive personnel in the last couple seasons, but scheme wise, calling everything out, captaining, and just like cleaning up messes. I mean, they've built the entire ship around him defensively on purpose. But, I understand there's this dichotomy where, like, the Hawks were really bad defensively this year. But if you look at the numbers, they were credible when Clint played on the on-off.
Yeah.
And, like, that's not and it was even more stark 2 years ago. Like, that's not a secret. And it's because they've built the whole thing around him. And, like, it's other than Gobert, I have a hard time thinking maybe certain, like, Sixers lines with Embiid, but, like, other than those guys, like, no team puts as much on them as the Hawks have put on Clint the last 2 years. And part of that's Trey, part of that's just like overall, like, not having great personnel, but like it has to be said, like, if they had an average defensive center the last 2 seasons, I know they were not great anyway. They would have been like, worse than the league bad at times. I mean, that's really how it would have had to happen. We've seen that on offs. We've seen it when he wasn't playing, when he was hurt, or even when he wasn't himself. I mean, I go back to November of last year when he was not himself very clearly, and they had no answers. And as soon as you get him back to being him, there's a reason they went 26-14 down the stretch. It wasn't only Clint, don't get me wrong, but like, you have to defend at a certain level to win at that clip. And I almost say single-handedly, it's not quite there, but like, he does the most by far defensively on the roster, and that's not like a coincidence.
Yeah, and to kind of cruise around the league a little bit and kind of take examples of the contrasting examples in some ways. I mean, I thought the Suns would be, I thought the Suns would beat Dallas, right? Yeah. And for me, like, the thing that really held the Suns back was Ayton. Now, Ayton's a good young center, and he has a lot going for him. But when it came time to try to get really nuanced around how they wanted to try to defend Luka, Ayton's ability limitation, not being to like a Clint level, processing information, being able to handle a lot of nuance in angles, communication, etc. The Suns struggled, and they struggled so much that Monty threw Biyombo out there for longer stretches, and Monty was like, well, I got to sacrifice on offense when Biyombo's out there. But if a lot of Hawks fans are like, let's go get Ayton. It's like, I don't think you understand the drop off in the area of defensive organization and anchoring and all that sort of stuff that you're missing. And then just in the finals right now, looking at Al Horford, familiar to all Hawks fans, not the vertical athlete that some guy, but he keeps him organized all the time. And the Warriors are having to work so hard on offense, everything that they do. And certainly Grant Williams is helping there as well. And Robert Williams, his ability to fly around even with the bad knee. But Al is the one who manages their defensive game plan basically the whole game. You'll see him doing it even when he's on the bench, kind of keeping them organized and stuff like that. And so it's just, a few kind of examples there where Ayton killed the Suns the deeper they got into the postseason with his inability to be more nuanced as a defensive anchor killed them. And it's probably the main reason that the Suns are as open as they seem to be to move on and to kind of make a change at that position despite him being a number one overall pick, is because he killed them in that area of play. And I think that's and I don't want to put like an unfair amount of blame, but Monty could not get the back line of the defense to where he needed to be to handle Luka. And Luka's a massive challenge, no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But, a guy like Clint or someone like that who has all of those kind of soft skills, you might say, on the court would have made a huge difference there. And that's just something I hope Hawks fans can kind of appreciate. I think Onyeka shows excellent processing for where he is and things like that. I think he's going to be really, really good in that area too. But man, Clint is unique at how good he is in all of that. And a part of that is just how invested he is. Like, he wants to be the organizer. He wants to be the defensive leader.
Oh, he
wants to be the communicator. And you can even tell when he talks post game, like he's the one who will speak to, in his low, raspy voice that's impossible to transcribe if you just have the interview, But you kind of know he's hitting on the real issues in the way that he can, and that's massive to me.
Yeah, I was gonna say he along with I think Bogey are the guys who are like, we'll just say the thing in public. I'm not sure if that that doesn't always mean anything. It's just like, if you want, I think Herb does the same thing, Collins too. But like in terms of like your vets who will, especially after a loss, will just be like, we're not very good at X. Like it's really been Bogey and Clint a lot that have just come out and said things that have to be said, and that's interesting on and off the floor. He's definitely a leader for them. And again, he's not the oldest guy in the world. Like you would think he's in his mid-30s. What we're talking about, he just turned 28 years old. I know this probably feels like a Capela love fest in a lot of ways, and it probably is from us. Like you and I like Clint a lot. But we've acknowledged both sides of, especially on offense. And I do wonder, as we sort of look forward a little bit here, is there anything? Let's assume just for this conversation that Clint is still the guy next year, still on the team, etc., starting center. Is there anything that you worry about, like slipping with him? Like, for instance, he's not a 7-footer. Like Capela's bigger than a Kongwu, but he's not your traditional 7'1" center. He's probably 6'9", maybe 6'10". Like he was seen as as funny as it says, he was seen as undersized when he was drafted as a center. Now Kongwu was actually undersized. But do you worry at all about him aging? Like in terms of like, what happens if he's 10% worse next year? Like, is there a line where you would start to worry, particularly because of the contract, but even beyond that, like just for next season on the court, do you have any concern about him slipping? Because it felt like that might be happening early last season, and then he kind of found it again, so it wasn't quite as much of a concern.
Yeah, I think you have to be, in the normal kind of pattern, I guess you'd see is, and you mentioned it, you already saw some of this year. He wasn't as good like closing out when an opposing team was playing 5 out, right?
Yep.
He wasn't as precise. He wasn't kind of as forceful in that area. And then just kind of navigating further away from the rim, not just kind of getting to someone, but dealing with a move, a secondary move, and it kind of anyone who has any kind of dynamic ability to kind of probe the defender. He wasn't as good this year as last year, and we all know the Hawks their defensive statistically they weren't as good defensively, and Clint's not even close to the first name I want to kind of put up there, but there were a few areas this season where he wasn't as good.
Definitely
quick turnaround from the previous season, the injuries and things like that, and stuff. And the part of it is the more the league moves to, the more like a greater number of teams in the league are kind of building a roster to give themselves the option to play 5 out. I think it's going to be a little harder for him to have that much effectiveness. I think we saw some of that this year, and I don't know why I would expect it to be better this year. I mean, the only reason I might be able to talk myself into it is the longer break.
Yeah.
Might be helpful. But the mileage, for a big man, it adds up, and it is, even though he's still, on the younger side of things, that's where I expect it to be. He's still good, like getting to the level of screen, recovering, but getting out there and needing to stay out there and help contain and move laterally, and kind of and do those sorts of things. He just didn't have nearly the amount of force. Now it's hard for me because when I'm watching them play, I'm like, well, the Hawks' point of attack defenders were so bad. It made it makes it hard for the big man. It puts way more work on the big man to come out there. So if the Hawks get back to, if the Hawks can add more point of attack defense, he might look better than he did last year. But I think he slipped some in that area. I don't think that should be a real surprise, and I would expect that it's most likely to kind of gradually kind of continue to kind of regress in that area as well. That's the area I worry. I think I worry about.
No, that's perfectly reasonable. And look, I mean, as much as I think it's clear that we value what he brings, the other side of my brain, the team building, roster building, salary cap side, like, I mean, he's making more money each season in the next 3 years. It is certainly plausible that he is not worth, quote unquote, the number of, I think it's almost 24 million in 24-25. Like, he'll be 30 and like maybe he's not that guy anymore. And that's conceivable. So like that is part of the calculus as well, which I think we need to acknowledge. As much as the Hawks are definitely in kind of a win now mode by all accounts from ownership on down, there is a consideration, especially when you factor in the luxury tax money that they might be spending, all that stuff, and the investment in Okongwu. Just the reality of that is that, as we said on that podcast, you don't usually draft a guy number 6 to be a backup for 3 or 4 seasons. It's just not what you do generally. So it's an interesting offseason across the board for a lot of different guys, but that decision, one way or the other, is going to happen in the next, 13 months. I mean, at the absolute latest, they can't go into year 4 of Okongwu with them on the roster again. I don't think. Maybe I'm wrong, but maybe they do it again this year. Maybe they run it back. But it doesn't stun me that they have all of these. I'm not even going to call them rumors. These rumblings about Ayton and Gobert. Like, that's not because they have a bad center situation. If anything, the way that you and I talk about it, they are really good at center because they are. But something's got to give there at some point. And I'm not sure what that's going to be. We talked about it on that show as well, but like whether they move on from Capela or maybe just capitalize on the Okongwu, move him. I do not think it's likely at all that both of those guys are on the team in 23-24. We'll see on this year. I mean, I would believe anything, to be honest. Maybe they just try to tweak the perimeter stuff and kind of keep those guys in place. If they move on from Clint, that will not stun me at all. And I think it will depend on their return. I mean, as much as you and I value him, as clear by this podcast, there are ways where it would make sense to move on. I will say that just as a team building viewpoint, they probably get worse in some ways. Like that's the thing. I have a hard time believing, short of an upgrade to Rudy or something like that, which I'm not even a huge fan of necessarily. But if you trade Clint for, let's say, an appropriately valuable wing player, and just kind of roll with a Okongwu plus a traditional plug and play backup center, are you better next year? It depends. Because I mean, as mentioned, they built so much around Clint, and we're both very high on Onyeka, but the odds that Okongwu next season, I want to say again, only next season at age 21, 22 is as good as Clint has been the last 2 years is very low. It's very low. It's possible, but it's not. I mean, and that should not be perceived as anything about Okongwu. We still like Okongwu quite a bit, but that'll be him at age 21, 22 in year 3. He probably isn't going to be as good as Capela has been the last 2 years. I'm sorry, he's not. So that's part of the calculus too.
For sure. And I'm going to give and this is going to seem, no, I want to give a shout out to our good friend, Josh Lane. And this is, I'm going back to the Wayback Machine, but Brad, I have a weird, quirky memory, but I remember on Cawcast, Josh's illustrious podcast he had for a while, when Dennis was coming up, and Dennis was kind of becoming obvious that Dennis couldn't be a backup much longer to kind of give Dennis his opportunity.
To Jeff. To Jeff T.
To Jeff. Yes. And I remember, I was on a number of Cawcasts, but this is not one I was on, but I don't remember who Josh was talking to, but they said, what about trading Jeff and making Dennis the starter? And Josh's response was this exactly. And it's so strange. I remember it word for word. He said, that's not going to make them better. And he was right.
Yeah. I mean,
and I feel like that applies right now to Capela and Okongwu. Now, you and I talked about Okongwu needs more minutes. He needs more reps. He needs that
he's got to play more
this season.
Yep.
And in my mind, the only way that it makes sense in my mind for the Hawks to say we're going to go a different direction at center is, and this is the only way I see it right now, is if they say to themselves, okay, we're going to start Okongwu at 5 and JC at 4, but we're going to manage rotations that JC spends like half his time on the court at center, and that JC kind of becomes a bit of a kind of a backup center. Now you have to have a third guy in there, but if they want to shift to playing smaller lineups and then split JC's time across the 4 and the 5 and have him playing the 5 when Okongwu is off more, and then having a third guy take 12 minutes or whatever that is a roster direction and a rotation construction direction that takes them, I think, clearly away from Clint. And I think there would be a trade market for Clint. So with Nate's the coach, I don't really see them doing that. Nate's pretty traditional in all of the things that he kind of does. But that's one avenue that a team in a vacuum could take, and I think it's less likely with Nate as the coach. But I mean, if you kind of look around, you ask yourself, Dallas would be better with Clint. Like Luka would be better off with Clint. And just kind of looking around, Chris Paul would probably appreciate Clint and kind of some of the nuance he brings. We can go on.
There are plenty of teams that would like to have Clint Capela, from Charlotte. You mentioned, Charlotte and Dallas. There are teams everywhere that would and in a similar way to what the Hawks got from Clint when they traded for him, and they traded him for him at a pretty interesting time when they definitely wanted to ramp it up and be better right away, and he helped to provide that along with other guys. So
and another really interesting one, this is the last one, is like the Pelicans are going to try to bring Zion back. Like Clint would save so much defensive workload from Zion in a way that Valanciunas can't, right? And in a way that Jackson Hayes can't, et cetera, et cetera. And if I'm trying to, protect a guy like Zion, I want a workhorse of a center that can handle all of the anchoring that you need. And I know that Zion's going to be a 5 eventually, whatever. He shouldn't be that his first season back from all these injuries. And so, and then pairing Clint with CJ and on, and stuff. So there's absolutely a market out for them if the Hawks decide that they want to take the roster in a direction that's a bit different than what they've had the last 2 seasons, which we'll have to just have to wait and see if that happens. But kind of going back to the beginning, they're in great shape if they decide keeping him is the right thing to do. They're in great shape if moving him is the thing to do. It might not be quite as true a year from now or 2 years from now, but right now I think they're in fantastic shape. If I had my way, they bring both back. But if they do something interesting to kind of, be bold and try to kind of bring a different kind of makeup, then that'll be super interesting to follow and kind of see what happens. So
yeah. I mean, I think too. Like, I am not in the camp of they have to do something at center. I do not believe that. I know that's out there, and I get the theory. Again, I just laid it out, but I get the theory behind that. But just kind of quietly, last year, Capela played about 2.5 minutes less per game, and that was in part because they were trying to give Okongwu some minutes, and Okongwu earned some crunch time. I mean, we go over that. He played some crunch times over Clint. Like, it's not a situation where he was passing him, but they, they played the matchups a few times with Okongwu versus Clint. Like, that's possible. And if you bring him back for another season, that's going to happen maybe even more. I mean, maybe you see Okongwu play 22 minutes a game versus 19 or 20, like whatever it's going to be. And we can save all that for later. I just think that overall, before we get out of here, Clint is still really good. There's some interesting roster building considerations in the future, but I want to just make sure we get the point across. And I knew we would, with the two of us talking about Clint Capela as people that value him and what he does, that he is really good still. I think it's, again, to say what I said at the very beginning of the podcast, he was a step down overall from the previous year, but the previous year was like elite, basically. So you can still be a little bit worse and still be really good, and that might even happen again. Like, if he's 5% worse, he's still a good starting center. Is he the same guy he was 2 years ago? No, but like, there are degrees here, and at some point, I mean, you would hope that Okongwu just like makes it undeniable, and you just have to play the guy, and that's what you're hoping for. He's going to be awesome. As I'm glad we did these in this order, so we could just point everybody back to the Econo episode where we talk about how awesome he's going to be. We did say all that on this podcast.
Yes.
Glenn, any final thoughts before we get out of here? Because I've kept you way too long, and I think you have to go to sleep just like I do. So
no, I think we hit on everything. I enjoy watching him all the time, so I'd be happy to see him back. But I'm intrigued if they make a move. I'm intrigued to see what it is. So I think it's only going to be good Clint stuff. I think going forward, either way, hopefully, unless they screw up with trade, which I don't think they'll completely.
Yeah,
because the market will be too strong.
If they make a change at center, it will definitely provide all kinds of fodder for us analysts, just like it did when they brought in Clint the first time, and it was like in the middle of an extended break and he was hurt, and there was like literally 6 months of can Collins and Capela play together discussion, and it was fun. I mean, and honestly, it worked. It worked more, almost better than I thought it was going to work. So like, it's just a really interesting thing, and we'll come back to it when we need to. But hopefully that's a full breakdown of Clint Capela. If you have more questions, please send them to Glenn and only Glenn. Do not tag me about anything. No, I'm just kidding. Glenn, I know if you're watching on YouTube, you can already see Glenn's handle on the screen if you're listening for a while. But this is like the 10th of these, I think, that we've done together. So thank you for all of this time. But please plug yourself before we get out of here.
Yeah, at Willis_Glenn for those listening. Peachtree Hoops, we're in draft, covering the draft class, trying to hit on everyone that might be targeted around 16, or if the Hawks move up a little, and things like that. So check that out there. But putting out observations on Twitter, and then ATL 29 podcast. Kevin and I are about one a week right now. We're slackers compared to Brad. That's we're both moving towards our senior phase, so we're a little slower maybe in that way. But
Kevin's already there. Who are we kidding? Kevin's already there.
No, I'm ahead. I'm older than Kevin.
I know. I just like to give.
but I mean, also, Kevin plays a ton of pickup basketball. So
listen, I can give Kevin grief with the best of them. Kevin is in way better shape than I am. Not close. And I am like 15 years younger than Kevin. And he's in way better shape than I am. So
yeah. So anyway, that's where you can find my stuff. But I've thoroughly enjoyed this. Always love talking with you, Brad, whether we've hit the record button or not. So appreciate you having me for all these, and look forward to getting the last several that we have here.
I think we have 2 left after this, and one of them is Trey. And what are you going to say about Trae Young? He's really good. That's all I got to say about Trey. No, thank you, Glenn, for joining me again. Yeah. I do sincerely appreciate it. As for everybody else, please subscribe to the podcast. The draft's coming, as Glenn mentioned before. There's lots of coverage coming here and on Peachtree Hoops and other places, so check all that out as well. And we'll see you all next time.